doing software development since, 1983. And believe it or not, that was not my first job. I started my work life in manufacturing, working in the steel industry. And the great thing about that was the steel industry really struggled in the early 80s. And I was able to, one, take my experience in the steel industry and parlay it into my first programming job. So I say this for you just so you understand, I do have some manufacturing genes in there somewhere, right? My family is all steel workers and, blue collar masons and good stuff like that. So when I first came across Kanban was in Lean Six Sigma class at Villanova. And I was thinking Lean Six Sigma, just kind of, do general skill building for myself. And I came across this thing they called Kanban, and I'm like, whoa, I think I can use that, right? Because it really takes much of what's in the lean practices and gives you a very tactical, structural technique that you can use. And I kind of quipped a little earlier that, David Anderson's book talks about Kanban as a software development methodology. And if you follow things David Anderson's way, you can absolutely build a methodology around Kanban, which is what he's done. What I want to share with you this morning is how you can use this technique to introduce lean into your organization with what I consider a very low barrier to entry. Right? The very first time I introduced Kanban, I introduced it to an organization in a meeting that we took less than 40 minutes to describe. Here's the process we're going to do. Right? And I did it with an infrastructure team. That team had already used Scrum, and they did pretty well with it, but they didn't love it, right? And we were about to embark on a series of capital projects in this infrastructure group, which really was turning them upside down, right? Typically, infrastructure groups work on work queues, right? You're either a help desk, second level support, or you're setting up servers, that type of thing. You're the DBA on call, whatever that needs turn out to be. Well, this organization, they were great at being first-line support for whatever they did, right? They excelled at it, right? Their verticals were so deep, it was incredible. However, they didn't know how to work together as a group very well. And they struggled with that. And in their prior experience, trying to do a capital project along with doing their regular work, the regular work always trumped capital project suffered and didn't get done, which is not a very good thing. For those of you who have any financial background in here, the capital stuff is like almost free money, right? So we don't let that stuff slide. And what I did was introducing this technique gave the teams a very visual way to manage their work. The good thing was that they all actually sat together in very low cue balls. The cue balls are only like this high, right? So by just creating the big visible chart in the area that they worked in, they already had a tool where they could manage their work. And I'm saying some of these things to you to share with you how simple this really can be. Right? I didn't have any special tools. We had a whiteboard, we had markers, and we just dove in. And the other part that I really liked about Kanban was that it gave me a new language to start to talk about, right? And Kanban in Japanese means, in a very simple translation, card signal. And in the manufacturing world, the way the card signals were used was to have a worker understand what to do next. They literally pulled a card out of a rack where someone had organized that work for them, right? And perhaps maybe at one workstation, that worker could make any of 3 different widgets, let's say, right? So someone in scheduling would know we need 10 widget A's, 15 widget B's, and 3 widget C's, right? And we need them in this order. So their work queue would literally be set up by someone who knew what the priorities were in the organization, and then you'd simply pick the next card and go work on it. Well, that's what I do when I set up teams to use Kanban in software development, is get them to put their work on cards. And I'm not particular about if it's a user story, a task, whatever unit of work you're already working in, this can work with, right? And we'll talk a little bit about, varying the size of those things and the impact it has when using Kanban, but essentially, that's what I've done. So there are a couple companies that really do excel in queue management. Starbucks is one, for example, that not only has figured out how to manage queues, but they vary queues based on location and time of day, right? And the amount of workers and the amount of traffic. So if there are any industrial engineers in the room, a lot has gone into time and motion studies here to figure out what's the most effective work process. And that's really what we want to be able to do for our organizations, is we're all working in systems. Unless you have a one-man company or one-woman company that's responsible for everything, you're involved in a system. And all systems have waste. This is another key thing within lean production, is to figure out how to eliminate waste. Because anything that's rejected is considered waste. Anything that sits in inventory is considered waste. Any time spent waiting is also considered waste. Right? So there are lots of forms of waste, but those are some, to me, the biggest ones we have. Time waiting, excess inventory, and defects. Right? And if that's all you did was help have things wait less time, build up less inventory, and have fewer defects, how many of you think things would be better in your company? Think that'd be helpful? So again, don't try to think too hard about this. Keep it simple. And be willing to change it. As quick as you make the change to use Kanban, also be quick to have rapid change. And I do believe that this conference, I was expecting to see a lot of analysts in the room. Do we still have any analysts in this room? Yes. I want you to understand how key I think your role is in the whole delivery cycle. Right? Unless you understand the language of the business, the voice of the customer, and in Lean, I've never heard anyone say this, but I'll say it, you need to also understand the voice of the technicians. Right? So you guys have to be able to speak. You're already bilingual. All user analysts, you already have multiple languages that you talk. That's essential because your role as translator is key. And what I want to encourage you is that probably a lot of what you do today is write down words as part of that translation. I would encourage you to see yourselves as translators and become storytellers. And that if you can start to build a language in a story, you can tell that story to anyone. And regardless of their background, chances are they'll understand much of what you said, versus if you're writing your words in English and you're forced to use the English language, which we know is an imprecise language, chances are not everyone's going to understand those written words the way they would understand hearing you tell the story, right? So I think that the analysts are key. Generally, you guys are at the front of the process as well as the back of the process. And your job should also be to look for ways. To look for ways, if not automation, at least smoothing out the pipeline of work. Right? Now, one of the folks who's done a lot of work on the theory of constraints, Little, has also been essential in the greater lean world. But I think the best gift he gave us was Little's law. And the law goes like this. It's a very simple mathematical equation. Is that throughput is equal to the work in progress, right, divided by cycle time. So knowing that, anytime that you can manage cycle time itself or the amount of work in progress, you can impact throughput. And what we found is the best place to work. Generally, we have business cycles that are fixed, right? And even if we make them up, we make up some fixed cycle. We deliver once a month. The post office delivers every day, right? Everybody has a cycle. So it's better to work with your work in process limits. It's the better place to be, right? To manage that equation on throughput. And with that, it's important, Little was also big on recognizing the idea of waste and that not everything was created equal. So not everything is the same size. So there's variability in the work. typically speaking anyway, particularly in software development, right? You have a developer who can code a method in 30 lines, and those of us who've done COBOL, we've worked on programs that are 4,000 or more lines long, right? Huge variability there. So one of the other ways that you can help smooth out your flow is figuring out what the variability is in your business and where possible, limit it, right? Quality also ties directly in with that. So I talked a little bit earlier about my mind. Kanban is not a software development methodology. It's a technique that you can apply to whatever you're doing today. And as well as you understand your business, you probably don't need anyone. After I show you some simple little things here, we'll go through and probably have plenty of time to practice it here this morning of applying this Kanban technique. And then it really is not a project management methodology, right? As opposed to Scrum. Those of you familiar with Scrum? Scrum's strengths really come from giving project managers a different way to manage risk. And it's much more than a card wall. A lot of people start out in the Agile space, right, by putting up this huge visible chart, and they just start putting the work up there. And that's a great way just to get started. But until you're looking at your work in progress limits, you're not really practicing Kanban. You're merely, moving cards along the wall, and that in of itself is not bad. So it's not just the cards, it's also managing that flow. That's the essential aspect. So, for controlling work in progress is essential. There are actually two different techniques that you can use, at least two. One of those is to control the work in its silos. So if we had 4 silos, the first was requirements, the second was analysis, the third was coding, and the fourth was testing, simplifying the 12 steps, right, into 4. Then you could set limits on those 4 key areas, right? That's one method. But another thing that you could do is to actually introduce what they call buffer queues. So instead of having just 4 queues, you would have 7. You'd have a requirements queue and then a buffer. And a buffer is simply a place where stuff sits on the shelf and waits. Right? And then you'd have your analysis queue and a buffer, where stuff that was done in analysis is ready to be coded, but the coders aren't working on it yet, sits in a buffer. Then you'd have your coding phase, right? And then you'd have another buffer between coding and testing. And the idea is that we want to figure out how to take an item from requirements and get it done as quickly as possible. So there is some prioritization of work that also happens. Right? Depending on the size of the work, it may or may not be terribly important. Because if what you're really trying to do is measure cycle time, the idea is just keep things moving through the pipe. It doesn't matter, small, medium, and large. If your work always varies, and that is your norm, maybe don't spend a whole lot of time trying to limit the variation or size it like all small things go in one swim lane, medium things go in another, and then the really big stuff has its own bucket. If your work is always a mix, to get started, just put it in the mix and let cycle time show you how you could actually start to tune them. Okay. Questions so far? Yes?
So we talked about the different queues. Is the buffer a queue or is it just a period of time?
It's a queue.
What is in that queue? What happens in that queue?
Good question, thank you. So the question is, what happens in the buffer queue? Essentially, the buffer queue is a place work sits and waits. Right?
So like it's ready for testing.
Yes, but the tester hasn't picked it up yet, so it's not really in testing. So in that scenario I just described, where you had the 4 stages and the 3 buffer queues, the stages are the work being done, right? The buffer queue is where work is waiting to be done. And what you want to do is limit how much work you can have in a buffer queue, and we're going to get into that in just a little bit with I'll draw up some examples. Good so far? You can prioritize work in a buffer queue. I actually prefer to see work prioritized across the board, so it wouldn't get prioritized in the queue, but it would just get, the work itself would be prioritized. And we'll talk about classes of service and things like that. Okay. So Kanban does have a couple of really properties are important to know. One, the first thing you really need to do is to actually visualize the workflow. We'll do that today. We'll, in your groups, pick someone's workflow and actually just sketch it out real quickly. And then decide how could you limit work in progress. And we'll talk about some techniques for that as well. A lot of people fret over deciding what the right queue size is. I'm one that believes in Kaizen, which is also small change in Japanese, so don't worry about it. When you start out, set a limit. If it doesn't work, change it. Right? The minute you find that is the blocker, change it. This is that's also why this really fits in with the Agile paradigm as well. We're not expecting you're going to go out and do some huge analysis effort on all your workflow and come up with an optimal workflow for the whole organization, publish it for everyone and say, go do the work. Right? Chances are that won't work too well, at least not for longer than a couple of days. So then you really do need to have good metrics. Right? And the metrics can be very simple. When I started this, I started with an Excel chart, and I simply put a date in and a date out. So I understood how much time a work item spent in a queue. Make sure that whatever your policies are around process, everyone knows what they are. Change them when you want, but make sure they're explicit. And then, using modeling techniques to recognize improvement opportunities. And I have to tell you that the biggest technique I have ever used for figuring out when to improve things is standing at the board and looking at what's wrong. Which project's blocked? Where are we stuck? Who's getting in our way? So, one of the gifts that we have from David Anderson is he's defined a recipe for success using Kanban. I think it's a really very good model. So, he talks about number one, focus on quality. That should always be the key of any lean endeavor that you do. Is there's got to have quality in the product. Reduce your work in progress. Deliver frequently. Balancing demand against throughput. Sometimes that gets outside of the control of a team. Sometimes that's a higher level management activity or leadership activity. Right? Because I don't know about you, but the project teams I work on, we can do very little to control demand. Right? So we've got to figure out how to really hone our throughput and work as efficiently as possible to not have waste in our process. Prioritization, while it can be important, I don't know that it is something that you have to have at the beginning. It's one of those kind of things that I find that if you need to prioritize the work, it'll be self-evident. Yes?
In terms of quality, is that being measured at each stage, like at each queue, like what comes out of requirements, the quality of that, what comes out of analysis and design, or are you more measuring the quality of the end product?
Very good question. Thank you for that. So the question is, are we measuring the quality as it comes out of each of your phases, or are we measuring the quality at the end? I think that the best answer to that is all of it, with the prime focus on the quality at the end. If you start at the end, you'll work your way back into where were we having quality issues. And what you need to do is become more predictable. The way to do that is to limit the variation. So for example, if you have a mixed queue of work, that's small, medium, and large items, and someone's going to say to you, when is this item going to be done? Right? And you're using cycle time as your measure, and you've got all these things in the same pile, your cycle time reflects the average throughput for the various sized items. So when an internal customer comes to you and says, when is this item going to be done? Right? And you give them the average number, and they're like, what the heck is it going to take so long? This is some itty-bitty change. Why is it going to take me 2 weeks to get this done? Well, it's because the answer you have is an average answer. So again, this is part of knowing what your space is and deciding what's the right answer for you. So if you needed to know the difference in the small, the medium, and the largest, one of the ways to do that is to create different classes of service. Another way to do that is to try to make everything a similar size. When I say similar, I don't mean it's not the same size. So I'm not saying turn everything into a 4-hour task. what I am saying is, if you could get everything into a range, let's say everything fits into a range of 4 to 12 hours, and you can figure out how to make your tasks no bigger than 12 hours, you've clearly limited the variability in size, and that will help you with having a more accurate predictor of flow because things are similarly sized. Right? And depending on your work, you may or may not need to have that degree of accuracy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you would cover the pushbacks, setting time frames, some of that.
Pushbacks to setting time frames, like how do you know when stuff's done? What needs to be done?
Pushback because I can't do it that quickly. Some of your experiences around trying to set up some of those time box things.
Okay, so do we answer that question now or later?
Oh, is that going to be hard? I just wondered.
I actually hadn't thought of it from that perspective, so I'm happy to take the question. The question is, how do you manage pushback? And I say, that's going to take too much time. Okay. Well, to me, part of that is then one answer, and it depends on politically where you stand and how the organization sits, right? Is, no, this is very good. This is what I do.
It's actually not that the executives say that's too much time. It's actually the people getting the work done saying they can't do it that quickly. We got to.
Aha, that actually comes into a different lean principle, which is you don't tell the worker how long it takes, you ask the worker how long is this going to take you to do it, and if they come back with a number that's too high,
Okay.
the conversation then shifts to help me understand why it's going to, what all are you going to do in that time? They come back and say it's going to take me a week. Gosh, a week seems long to me. I was expecting something more like a day, maybe a day and a half. Could you explain to me, what are you going to do in the week? And have them break down the tasks. And then maybe in that explanation, you'll be, oh my gosh, I can see why that's going to take you a week. Or it's like, you know what? Your design is way more elaborate than I was hoping for. All I really wanted was this. Could you give me this in a smaller window? And I'm like, oh yeah, I could do that. Right? So you just... But it is a negotiation, and it's about pushing the work question down to the person who's actually doing the work. That's one of the best things I think that came out of the Toyota production system was valuing the worker and what the worker had to say about the work and let them figure out how to optimize it. You can give them a goal that says 100 widgets an hour is not enough. But what you shouldn't do is say, and here's how you're going to get to 100. You can say, I want you to work to try to figure out how can we get to 100 widgets.
Craig, you addressed the opposite where management's giving you time.
Management's giving me time.
And they just don't get what it takes, and we try to communicate that to them.
So a couple things here. To me, this is where big visible charts really do help. That executives can see as well as anybody else. They don't listen as well as most people, my experience, but they can see as well as most people, right? So if you can take them to the project wall and have them come on some regular basis, they'll get a true appreciation for what the work is. And they'll see that their work is moving. When I was doing consulting, I worked with a client, and the CEO was all in favor of, let's do this Agile stuff, right? It's great. And I'd been there like a month, and I hadn't seen the guy except when I had a one-on-one meeting with him. And that to me is not a good signal. And then one day the CTO says to me, hey Linda, by the way, Jim thinks this is great stuff. He's been coming down here every Friday night, like around 6 o'clock, and checking out all the project boards we have going on. And he loved it because he can see the work, he sees the progress. It's like, oh, great. So use those big visible walls for one thing. The next thing really is to then negotiate on scope. And that's the biggest thing to talk about how could we get you to where you need to be? Help me understand where's the highest value for our customer. And let's work on that first. And then see if you can negotiate your way into that. And simply, if that's never a chance, then you simply have to have the conversation. Well, somehow, there has to be more resources or something that helps make that equation work. And that's when you're going to need some hard statistics around defect rates. And I have a team I've been working with this year that has actually doubled their velocity in the past 4 months. Well, guess what? They're on average working 60 hours a week. And guess what else happened? Yeah, defects went up. They finished their last sprint got into their end game testing, and all of a sudden they had 80-some defects in 2 weeks. They're like, where the heck did that stuff come from, right? So the good news is I've been able to take that information back to the VP and tell them, we have got to create some slack. Not only create slack, but we've got a team that's well overstressed, right? We're simply asking too much, and the defects are up. And what the VP always tells me is, Linda, quality's the first thing. I said, developers hear the date's the first thing. They all hear the date. They don't hear you saying to me, quality's first, right? So that's the other important part of your role as a leader, is to make sure those right messages are getting into the staff. But Slack is actually the only thing that will enable you to make change, right? If you don't have time to think, first off, forget about making the change. The first thing you have to do about this is think about it. We are knowledge workers. It's one of the big differences in assembly line work and software development or systems development, is that fundamentally we are knowledge workers, and the one thing a developer cannot tell you is how long it's going to take her to think about something, right? And that's why we always give wacky numbers when we give estimates. It's another thing I like about Kanban, is I quit asking developers for estimates. Everybody's happy, right? Because you know how estimates go, right? The answer you get, anybody? What kind of answer do you get if you ask for a programmer for an estimate?
A year.
A big one, right? A swag. What else do you get? Anybody ever get the answer they think you want them to say? Right? Right? Then I've also had a developer who everything was the same size. Nope, sorry, it's all this big. Okay. Guy's a DBA. I know he does stuff a little small, make a SQL thing, change, to changing tables, whole structures. It's all the same size to him. So now with Kanban, I don't ask, because we don't estimate. Another thing is the value about this process. Yes?
When you give up the estimating, how do you get the notion of the conversation that should happen over cost? How much time are we going to invest
Yes.
in this capability?
That's a very good question. The way I'd like to change that conversation is, what's the value of it to you and how much should we spend, right? What's the right amount of spend here? Don't ask me to give you just an estimate of cost. Tell me, what's the affordability? Can you afford to pay $10,000 or can you afford to spend $150? Because that should weigh into our solutioning, right, and our designs, is to understand not only what can you afford, but what's that value back to the organization, right, and back to our customers. Because overall, we should be thinking about this from the perspective of the voice of the business and the voice of the customer. And I'd like to actually just change that back into, tell me what's the right amount, and let's see if we can come up with a design that actually fits.
You know what unit of measure are you using in the conversation? Is it dollar?
It ends up being dollars, because all of this, and any conversation can be rolled into money, right? If I take cycle time, I can turn cycle time into the size of the team, the cost of the team, and give you $1. And say, are we going to be at this point? Does that answer your question?
Just so.
Thank you. Reducing variability, which improves quality. Every time variability goes down, quality goes up. These things work on that scale exactly that way. Quality goes down, variability's going up. And having less variability really shortens the amount of requirements we need. So we're talking about here just pretty much how are we going to create some slack. So once you've created a little bit of slack, the other aspect is also to have a rhythm to the projects. And that's what work in process and creating flows through a system gives you a rhythm and a consistent rhythm. You don't want it to be, you don't want the beat to go and then, how many companies work that way? If that's your rhythm, chances are you haven't done everything you could do to work on smoothing out the flow. As one of the things that's actually a benefit of Scrum, and why Scrum actually works, is because what Scrum does is help create that cadence for you. It just happens to be in a fixed cycle. It's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever cycle you've picked. Using the technique of Kanban can be totally absent of cycle, and you can never actually have one. Right? And there's a technique that they talked about, this train station model in software releases, where when your code is done, you take it to the train station, i.e. a secured place, that it sits and waits, and the next time the train comes by to deliver software to your customers, it picks up whatever's in the train station and puts it in production. So that's how using Kanban, it really doesn't matter what the cycle is. As soon as code is ready, again, whatever that production train, and this, the thing that's important about this, I think, is you can separate development from delivery. We can develop code much faster. Most organizations, particularly using Agile practices, get to a place where you can develop code much faster than your customer wants change. Right? So we can make changes once a week. Fabulous. Your customer says, you mean to tell me I'm going to have to figure out there's a new thing on my screen every week? Forget about it. Not going to do that. I'll take change once a quarter. You guys do whatever you need to do. So again, using a Kanban model, you set up more of a train station approach that said your quality's got to be great before you drop it off at the station, right? Because once it's packaged up, you don't get to open that box again. So Kanban methods, for me, again, visualize the process, and the important part about the visualization is the bottlenecks become evident. Now here's the funny thing about bottlenecks and smoothing out flow in a process. All large systems have bottlenecks, okay? And when you first map out your flow, and if you do a value stream map using another term, right, you will find out where things sit waiting for a long time, and you need to decide, why does it wait? Is it a good reason, and could we change it? What you'll find is that the minute you clear up a bottleneck, it moves. The bottleneck is a demon that lives in our systems, right? A hairy little beggar. Right? So you're never really done smoothing out process, in my experience, as much because business is always changing, right? If business never changed, you could set up an ideal flow, you know, close the door, go home, go on vacation for months, because there's no more change that's going to be needed. But because business is always changing, you're going to find yourself chasing bottlenecks. And that's okay, as long as what you're doing is making things better. Now, with work and process limits, the key thing is, if you change a bottleneck and you move it by changing a WIP limit, and you create a whole new, bigger bottleneck, move back. Don't be afraid to go back, it's okay. Always move towards better flow, right? And if once in a while that feels like you're moving backwards, you're really moving forwards with flow. And to me, until you move backwards, until you get to a part where you've broken the flow model that you set up, you haven't finished tuning it. Not even close. It's always going to be encouraging continuous improvement. One of the things I've really liked is that, particularly as an introductory technique to people who are not familiar with Agile and who are also not accustomed to doing retrospectives, they do these things we used to call post-mortem. Anybody still do post-mortems here? Yeah. What's wrong with a post-mortem? It's after the death. Yeah, and not only is it after the death, but it's also when the project team is broken up. So great, you pack up your little lessons learned, off to the next project I go. Oh, drop that off, here you are back in the same quandary again. Agilists believe in constant inspect and adapt. Kanban, done well, gives you that chance, and I take that opportunity almost every day on a short bit. So I'll share an experience I had when I was working with the Motley Fool. And we did retrospectives every 2 weeks, like we were supposed to. And the organization was the software development organization was predominantly male by a huge factor. Right? I mean, like more than 90%. And these guys hated getting together and talking about retrospectives. And they got it down to a science. What worked well? What didn't work well? What do I want to improve? And they'd be done in 15 minutes. Right? Yeah, we communicate great. We like having beer Fridays. And we think we should have more beer. Would be their retrospective. I'm not kidding. Yeah, And you couldn't argue with that thinking, right? Okay. But we weren't changing much process stuff. And guess what? When I took them to Kanban and let them make a change every day when something didn't work, they were like, and we could do it, we could make a change. We'd have a conversation truly in less than 15 minutes and decide, here's the bottleneck, here's what we need to do about it, change the board. The vice president of operations happened to sit directly across from the board. His seat was right here, if that was the wall where the board was. And I was a consultant there. And one day he says to me, he said, Linda, how much am I paying you to change whiteboards around here? He says, all you seem to do is move the whiteboard. I said, yeah, that's how we're getting better. It seems so simple. All I thought we were doing is moving lines and things like that. It looked to the observer to be very superficial. He wasn't there for those extra 5-10 minute conversations every day when we made changes. So what we did do then, we found over time that talking about these changes in a 5 to 15 minute increment, that was great day to day, but guess what? Every now and then they felt like there was some elephant in the room that no one brought up because we couldn't talk about it in 15 minutes, much less that they want to say it where the whole world could hear them. And we implemented retrospectives monthly that were much more formal to give them that second view of the world. Or if someone said, we need to talk about this in a closed space, right? We would just get together, talk about what was wrong, talk about what needed to be fixed. So if you were, moving towards Agile and someone says you have to do your retrospectives with your sprint cycle every 2 weeks, I would have to agree that if you're doing Scrum, yes, that's when you're supposed to do it, but I'd also say vary what happens in that retrospective. You can have small retrospectives sometimes and then have a big one every now and again if that's really what helps your organization. The other part I found about it is that because this was a simple technique applied to the process these guys were naturally doing, their resistance to change was very low. And it showed them places where what they were doing probably wasn't the optimal thing. So here's a sample life cycle. Right? We have an inception phase, elaboration, construction, and transition. And sometimes we have phase gates in each one of these. And sometimes we have phase gates based on the disciplines. Right? You may not have phase gates in a Kanban. It doesn't have to happen that way. If you walk into a brand new company, these guys are like the Wild West. The process is hard to really see. There is one, but you don't recognize it because you're not from the West, you're from the East, right? Where things are a little bit more structured. Maybe you won't find phase gates there, and that's a challenge I think you'll need to look at. So how do we know when we're done? And I can tell you the way that the teams I've worked with know when they're done. It becomes obvious to them that a particular project no longer has high value for the customer. And there's demand coming at them. It's like, and we're being told we got to do these other 6 projects. How are we going to do that? We got all this other stuff left to be done. Now, if you're doing prioritization and really trying to go after your high value items first, chances are that stuff at the back end isn't that sexy and really isn't all that important. And projects then get canned because they're not as valuable as the project potential coming in the door. And I let that be the stage gate in that scenario. Right? And typically when that's happened, we also hadn't used up all the budget either, which was a good thing. Because we saved to work on some other projects. So, questions so far? I'm going way too much talking. You guys need to talk more. No, I'm going to make you get up and do this, right? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm just thinking about in terms of the amount of change that happens here and talking about people not being prepared for it. What type, if you're just starting to apply Agile, what type of project would you recommend starting that on?
Not exactly on topic, but I'd love to take the question.
Okay.
Okay. So, will you guys, may I take your question?
Yes,
okay, thank you. Lots of folks have different opinions on this, and I'm going to share with you what's worked best for me. The best way to start an Agile project team is with the people who want to do it. And when I say people who want to do it, I mean the executive who's willing to support it, the team who's willing to make the changes, who's not afraid of skinning their knees, right? Stumping their toes, right? And essentially, I'm looking for that fearless element in a group that says, we're going to change and we know we're not going to get it right the first time and it's okay because we're going to work on a goal. That being said, I'd also encourage you not to pick the lowest risk project in the organization. Nobody's going to care. I also encourage you not to completely cherry pick the team. It can't be all your already A players. Because guess what? In my experience, all your A players can get stuff done regardless of system they work in. They just figure it out. That's what makes them an A player. Do you want to put an A player or two on the team? Heck yes, and they're all going to be begging, right? So to me, what you want is to set up an environment where people look over the hall and say, I don't know what those people are doing over there. They look like they're having fun. I want to be on that project. That's the environment you want to create, right? By the same token, you can't pick the highest risk project in the company. Unless you make the change, the company's simply going to fold, right? And this is the all or nothing thing. And I've seen it work in all or nothing because the driver for change is so impactful, people are willing to make that move, right? I'm getting some nodding heads here. And I have been in those situations where we were betting the farm and we knew we couldn't do it the way we were doing work. What we were doing. When you know what you're doing is not working for you and it's broken, and those are the people you're looking for. They may not have the answers to anything, but they know what they're doing is way too painful. Look for those folks, right? That's a good place to start. Okay? Sorry. Whip limits, stop the line behavior. When I say stop the line, I'm talking pulling the andon cord and we stop, if you can visualize material going down a manufacturing line, right? I worked in the steel industry, right? We used to take these huge slabs of steel and turn them into thin plate that was put on a coil and became refrigerators in cars and other things like that. When they stopped the line, clunk, it was a whole huge sound. The whole organization could hear, we've shut down the mill. When I'm talking stop the line in software development, I'm talking the very same thing. Everybody stops. This is not one or two people run off the side and go fix a little problem. I mean, we as a team, which is another, agile concept that we're collaborating and we're working together as a team, not as individuals. We are going to stop what we're doing because we need to fix this problem now. Now in Scrum, some people talk about canceling a Scrum because things aren't going well. Very few times have I ever seen anyone really need to cancel a project. The only time you really need to cancel is when funding's been pulled, right? If something's happened and you no longer have money, there's an obvious we're going to stop. I believe instead you can use this technique we call swarming. Anybody heard of that before? Right? Where really, literally everyone on the project gets into a room and brainstorms, problem solves, and comes up with a path to follow. Right? And then, because when you get teams kind of in this habit of swarming, they learn to work well together. And one of the things that I think is the best thing is they learn to become good problem solvers. Right? To me, the best teams I've ever worked on, one of the capabilities of that team was that they could solve any problem because they worked well together, they understood each other's language, and they had enough complementary skills and personalities that they could handle a wide mix. And to me, that's an important thing to work towards. Swarming and collaboration, I believe, are one of those techniques that build huge buy-in in your organization. And you shouldn't discount the value of putting folks in a room and letting them solve a problem. They knit together better. They learn a lot from each other in these tough times. And anybody think back to a moment when it was a crisis moment and you worked with a group of people to solve a problem and how good that felt at the end, right? We've all had those little experiences.
Well, Linda, some of my experiences, I've noticed that some team members like to try and solve problems via email. So what I do is I definitely pull them into a meeting so that collaboration takes place. And choose the proper
That's a good point, Jerry, very good. Do you have a point at which you say the email's already gone too far, let's have the meeting? Is there
Yes.
actually something, how many emails is that for you?
For me, it's probably about 3.
Great, that's the same number I have. When I see the third email, it's like, we're done. We need to get together. Yes?
It's like good news, bad news where we work, you know, a lot of the people are allowed to work from home. So they're in a siloed world and they don't, you know, pick up the phone call and the emails just go. I just started this team 2 years ago. And some of these emails, because these people have been there for years, hey, what I print them can be 20 pages long. And I'm like, pick up the phone.
Yeah.
Like, by the time I read that and try to figure it all out, it's 2 hours later and it could have been a 5-minute conversation. They're so used to being short. I told everybody, I got my origin selling. I'm like, you know, you're not.
That's actually a very different
work.
problem, right? People who work remotely versus people who are in the office.
It's a big problem.
It's just like, that is a distributed work team, any way you want to look at it. The question is, how distributed are you? And are some people always distributed? You know, they work in the remote location? Yeah. Yeah. I'll get into that. But truly, to me, there are a couple things that technology is in our favor. VoIP, right? Skype calls, chats, anything so that it's not an email. No one would write, I don't think, a 20-page chat, right? So online chats, I think, I've worked with teams that do this, particularly that have people that work in various time zones, is they have a live running chat that's also, you can capture it and save it, right? So it becomes a part of their record. And the chat's always open. Some people do that if you're fortunate enough to have a team space, you know, it's actually more of a room. They'll have a voice line open for the remote workers, and they can just call out into the room anytime. Hey, anybody there have a question about such and such? And the other real value of that is the person that's working remote hears the chatter in the room. And that'll be a signal to them, hey, you guys are talking about something. Guys, by the way, is a non-gender term for me. You guys are talking about something. What's going on there? I'd like to be in the conversation. So that team engagement is essential.
Yeah, and to relate that back to cadence, I guess employee rhythm, if I limit that three email limit, if I do that enough, it becomes a habit, and you know that after the third email, I'm as project.
You're coming.
I'm gonna call a meeting. Yes.
Yes. So maybe that encourages them
Yeah.
to either not have those email threads or to solve things quickly and not just BS back and forth. Cut to the chase, find out what you need to know. Again, more value of WIP limits. It gives an opportunity for teams to start to open the breadth of their skills, right? We've gone through so many things of centralization, decentralization, specialization. We are clearly living in an age of specialization. Agile says everyone always has a specialty. We all have core strengths, each one of us. Innate abilities that were given to us or that we grew and developed. Right? Don't expect you're going to change that. You're always going to have your core strengths. But the fact of the matter is, much of the work that gets done on a project team, anybody who has a little bit of subject area knowledge could probably work on some portion of it. And seeing those cues, buffer cues, back up, is a signal to the team that we need to move our work to where the things are getting backed up. So it does really encourage teamwork. I want to talk something a little bit different, classes of service. Classes of service to me is something that you get to generally not when you first pick up Kanban, but as you start to mature, right? And you find that it's becoming very tough perhaps to have everything of a similar size. Let's say you just pick that arbitrary 4 to 12 hours as that similar size model, and then all of a sudden you've got a brand new, R&D's come out with this whole brand new thing, and problems are much bigger. We've got bigger issues to solve, and it's not going to work well. Perhaps classes of service works there. Another area where class of service works is if you are in, particularly an infrastructure team, or even software development teams. How many of you guys work with software development teams? Right? How many of your software developments do a mix of maintenance and new development? Is that a pain? Yeah. Whoever thought that was a good idea? Class of service is one way to help try to tackle that problem, right? So one of the things I've been able to do, and back to your question around budgeting, right, is get the executive to tell me how much money, time, whatever, should I spend on this new thing versus how much effort should we spend keeping the lights on. That's clearly an executive choice. If you as the project manager are making those decisions day to day, chances are somebody's going to call you out and say, you goofed up, dear Laylee. What do you mean I goofed up? Those kind of decisions need to come from the executives. And a good way to start that conversation is about how can we define the classes of work we have? Yes, we have maintenance, right? We have new development, and then we also have hair on fire. Anybody have hair on fire? Hair on fire stuff, right? Literally have called the hair on fire lane the fire lane, right? I've also used it to add bugs, defects. It's another class of service possibly, right? That some of them, unfortunately, sometimes we learn about a defect because a hair on fire thing happens. You're like, oh my gosh, hair on fire is always a defect in there somewhere. But not all defects are created equal, right? Nor should they get the same level of service. So organizations define these levels on many different bases. Some folks have tiered customer pools, right? That your tier 1 customers, who they get anything they want. I work in healthcare, and trust me, we have our 800-pound gorilla too. And the things that our organization will do for that gorilla are amazing, but they clearly have their own class of service, right? It doesn't matter what's in the contract, trust me. This is contract aside. Anybody else have this going on in their company, right? Contract says one thing, what we're asked to do, totally different. But plan for that, right? The other thing about planning for it is then you can report on it, right? So once you get to class of service, then you can start bringing some visibility to, do you know how much food we had to feed the 800-pound gorilla last month? Do you know how many people starved because we were stuffing that gorilla again? Right? That's where class of service to me is valuable. And it clearly can be a strategic conversation where anybody in budgets right now? Budget cycles is another good time to bring up the idea of class of service so that the whole organization agrees how we're cutting up the project pie. And the nice thing about it is that not all classes of service have to have equal weighting, right? You might decide in your organization, maintenance needs 70% of the love we have to offer. Leaves us 30% to do any new development stuff. So clearly, you're gaining new development there. And you can flip that paradigm on its end. I worked in an organization back in the mid-90s where a new CIO came in and said, you know what, looked at all of our models and said, yep, we're doing 80 cents of every dollar is being spent on maintenance here. We only get to spend 20 cents on new stuff. Company was in trouble. He said, guess what? I'm flipping it over. And he literally flipped it on a dime. 20% of our energy got spent keeping the lights on. And trust me, they dimmed every now and again. Right? And we moved to an 80% doing new work. It can be very impactful. What time do we have? Till 11:30? 11:15. Okay, so I'm going to run through this. Scrum bond. Pretty much is simply applying the work in process cues. And I'm going to get to an example unless you want me to stop here around anything. In Scrum, typically you're using user stories, and that's your unit of work, right? And just so you know, even when I'm doing user stories in Scrum and I break down into tasks, I don't set up the board by tasks, I set it up by story. And the reason I do that is that you can do 90% of every task and not finish one flipping story. I've seen teams do this. It's also why I don't like to track time. Right? Because people tell you, well, we used up all the time. Well, heck yeah, the clock went around. We used the time. So if you're using user stories, track the flow by the story, not by the tasks beneath it. Here's a sample Kanban board. This is actually coming from a relatively new tool in the market called Get Kanban. I think these guys have done a really good job because you can vary almost anything on this board. This particular one has 4 queues, and in these queues, they have a ready queue and an in process. In this case, the ready queue is the buffer, right? Where stuff is sitting waiting to be worked on. And they do other cute things like, they use individuals' pictures on it and stuff. And it's all color-coded. So you can color code by class of service. And when I say this, because you can do this with cards, right? You can do this with paper. You can have a visual signal that knows that if it's pink, we need to do it now, right? Versus if it's green, when we get to it is okay. And whatever color scheme you use, doesn't matter. Do what works in your group. Ask people, say, hey, what scheme would talk to you, right? The other thing, though, is once you develop a scheme, post it next to the board so that all the people that come and look at your work can also understand what legend you're using. You also see evidence of buffer queues here. Look at the top under development. There's a number 1, I think, under feed the ducks. And there's a 7 up and ready. So now they're using multiple width limits, right? So what they're saying is, we can handle 7 things in this ready queue. Up at the top in development, can you see that way up there? Oh, sorry, where's my cursor here? Where'd it go? Where'd it go? See these? This number here, number 7? This is the width limit for this ready queue. Whereas over here, here's the limit for things that can be in analysis. And of these 4, 2 of them can be in process. That better be what that says. Does that look like a 2 to you?
No.
Look fuzzy to me.
It's hard for back in.
Yeah, it's hard from up front too. I apologize. These things don't always show exactly what you want. Then we can see another ticket here that has all sorts of information on it. There's probably something here about it being urgent. It's probably blocked. There's some notes here about it, and it's got a calendar-sensitive date. So here's another thing I've done with cards, visual cue, right? Things are usually either sensitive because of time or because of money, right? So we've done simple things like put little symbols. If it's sensitive because of money, use a dollar sign. If it's sensitive because of time, you can put a clock on there. We actually used to draw a little time bomb icon thing. And then the way we prioritize things is if it was sensitive by time and money, that would have to be the highest priority. Unless there was a time that trumped everything, right? So you can use these simple little clues that help engage the team, manage the work, and be effective. Questions about this board?
Is ready a buffer queue?
Pardon me?
Is ready a buffer queue?
Yes, in this case, ready is the buffer queue. And here's another example where, in this case, ready here is the first buffer queue. It's actually the starting block, but development being done here is the buffer queue. That this is a buffer here. And we need someone to verify the work. That's another buffer queue. Some people just label them buffers. However, that can actually work for you. It doesn't have to be anything terribly scientific. So with that, I want to ask that we take at least 2 groups or 3. Which would you guys rather work in? Groups of 2 or 3? We're going to do a 10-minute exercise and we're going to set up some Kanban boards. 3? Okay, so 1 group here, 1 group over there, 1 group up here. I have plenty of tape. And what I'd like you to do is, the process is fairly simple. I'd like you to pick 2 or 3 groups. So you can figure out which group you want to go to. It really doesn't matter. Pick someone's process. And it could be as, you do rock, paper, scissors, whatever you want. Someone says, hey, I want to map my process, whatever. And I want you to do a very simple mapping of how you understand your process to work today. Lay that up there. So we'll do that in the first, take maybe 3 minutes to do that. And then we'll come back and talk about, in your groups, talk about where are the areas where things get stuck. Next up, we'll talk about how many people. Let's write this down. So the first step is pick someone's process. Then talk about where does it get blocked. And then talk about the people by numbers only in each of the process points. So if your process goes across various silos of work, Make sure you got each people numbers for each of the process blocks, and I'm going to show you how to start with setting up WIP limits for that. Okay? 3 groups. Define your process. Figure out where you think it's blocked immediately. Have that first conversation, and then talk about the numbers of people in each one. And I'll come around and work with groups, and we'll talk about getting you guys set up on how do you start with work in process limits, and then you can talk through a mock problem and figure out how to change that pretty quickly. Okay? I will ask that you be gentle writing on the paper. Make sure we don't scar up the walls. Okay? Very good. We'll do this exercise in about 10 minutes and leave us 5 minutes for wrap-up questions. Does that sound good?